It was a busy time on the island of Sodor. The railway inspector was coming. The signals were checked. Platforms were scrubbed. Everyone wanted the railway to look its best. At last, the big day was here. At last, the big day was here, Sir Topham Hatt said. Percy asked. Gordon huffed, said Thomas. Added Sir Topham Hatt. Puffed Thomas, asked Percy. Gordon snorted, said Emily. Said James proudly. Puffed Thomas. That afternoon, Thomas and Percy arrived at the quarry. But as the stone was loaded onto the trucks, a big cloud of stone dust whooshed down and landed right on top of Thomas. Coughed Thomas. Percy moaned. Thomas puffed. So Thomas raced off. But when he arrived at the washdown, Emily was already there, covered in soap suds. Said Emily. Thomas huffed, and he steamed off to help Percy. Thomas and Percy puffed across the countryside. But when Thomas and Percy arrived at Brendam Docks, they saw Sir Topham Hatt. He was with the railway inspector. Puffed Thomas. So Thomas raced back to the washdown. When Thomas got to the washdown, James was already there. James sniffed. This made Thomas cross. He wanted to win first prize more than ever. But James's red coat did look very shiny. Thomas puffed to himself, and he steamed back to the docks. Percy and Thomas shunted the quarry freight cars into place. When they had finished, Percy was dirty, and Thomas was dirtier than ever. So they raced to the washdown as fast as they could. This time, Gordon was there. Gordon puffed proudly. Thomas thought Gordon looked splendid. Then James and Emily pulled into the station. They looked splendid too. Emily's wheels looked shinier than ever, and James's red paint sparkled in the sun. Now Thomas was worried. Thomas puffed sadly. Percy puffed. Percy and Thomas were covered in soap suds. They were scoured and scrubbed and brushed and buffed. Percy loved being washed, but now Thomas was sad. He thought he would never look as grand as the other engines. James, Emily, and Gordon were waiting for the railway inspector. Gordon puffed proudly. Said James. Emily added. Emily added. The engines tried to find the sunniest spot in the coal yard, so James backed up. Suddenly, he bumped into a freight car. The freight car rolled into a lever, and then there was a whooshing sound. James puffed. Coal poured out everywhere. It poured onto the tracks and all over Gordon, James, and Emily. They weren't gleaming and shiny anymore. So Topham Hatt and the railway inspector arrived. So Topham Hatt and the railway inspector arrived. The railway inspector said crossly. Just then, Gordon blew to clean his funnel. Coal dust shot into the air. It covered Sir Topham Hatt and the railway inspector. Coughed Gordon. At At last, Thomas and Percy arrived. When the railway inspector saw Thomas and Percy, he was delighted. He said, "Thomas and Percy won first prize. The railway inspector gave them each a special rosette." Thomas and Percy beamed with pride. "Puffed Thomas," puffed Percy.